Hello, everybody. It is Tom, the very lowest of men of 6++ here, and I am back with a new series called Play Your Cards Right. This is going to be all about secondary scoring in 10th edition. What I've done is I've shuffled the pack. I'm going to draw 4 cards each episode and talk through some of the things you as a player can think about in attempting to maximize your ability to play the game, score your secondary cards, get those points, and cover it from a range of angles strategically and theoretically as well. I drew the cards on Facebook earlier on, so for this week we're starting with Engage on All Fronts, Overwhelming Force, Extend Battle Lines, and Storm Hostile Objective. In terms of how this is going to work, this is the structure. Oh, I better move my little face there. The 4 T's are how we're going to organize this. So we're going to be thinking about the trade-offs, the tools, the twist. Do you ditch this card? Do you keep this card? And whether or not you can consider taking it as fixed, as a fixed objective, and what you might need to think about if you choose to do so. So let's get started. Number 1, Extend Battle Lines. This is a great card, okay? Just to remind you how this works. At the end of your turn, if you control 1 or more objective markers in your own deployment zone, and you also control 1 or more objective markers in no man's land, this secondary mission is achieved and you score 5 victory points. If you only have 1 unit remaining in your army, oh dear, then this secondary mission is instead achieved at the end of your turn if that unit controls 1 objective in no man's land, but in this instance you score 2 VP instead of 5 VP. So if it's gone really wrong, you can still scrape out some points. This is a great card. I think generally players are going to be happy if they draw this because in many ways the trade-offs are minimal. Holding your own home objective and holding at least 1 objective in no man's land is fairly sort of minimal requirements. These are things you should be trying to do to score primary on a lot of the missions in 40k anyway. It doesn't require an enormous amount of commitment of forces into different areas to do this. And it's something that you want to be trying to do in order to make life difficult for your opponent anyway. So it ties into probably how most armies want to play the game. And it also gives you a nice generous 5 points for that as well. In terms of what units you might want to do this, you want some primary brawlers, stuff that's good and tough to go and stand on points and hold them, take them off the opponent. Deathwing Knights are my example here. Another option you always have is good OC via vehicles or cheap troops with OC2 to make sure you've got a bunch of bodies on a point outside your deployment and you can keep on holding it. Sticking objectives also helps a little bit with this. And obviously some of the troops units can do this as well. In general, fairly straightforward, and you can usually expect to be scoring this, especially if you draw it in the first rounds of the game. So the twist, do you drop it? Do you get rid of Extend Battle Lines? I'd suggest the only time you'd want to twist on Extend Battle Lines and change it for a CP or get rid of it at the start of the turn is if things have gone very wrong. You've already lost a bunch of resources, you're struggling to hold your own backfield, you might have lost it, you don't think you're going to be able to go back and do it. Sometimes in a game, you can still very much be in a game when this has happened because you might have swapped board sides, i.e. you've taken their backfield and they've taken yours. So if that is the case, you're not going to be able to score this, but you might well still be in a good position to play the game. So that's when you might want to ditch this for something else. Otherwise, I think this is one you should certainly be attempting to score. You can't take this as a fixed secondary, so we don't need to talk about it just as well because it's far too easy for a fixed secondary. Next up, we've got Overwhelming Force. This is quite a straightforward one as well. It's a killing secondary. So whilst this secondary mission is active, each time an enemy unit that started the turn within range of an objective marker is destroyed, you score 3 VP to a maximum of 5. Note that victory points are scored even if such a unit is destroyed and then resurrected. And if you score any VP from this secondary during a turn, then at the end of that turn, this secondary mission is achieved. So remember that one. That's certainly valuable when we come to think about the trade-offs and other things. So what are the trade-offs with Overwhelming Force? Well, you're going to have to go and attack things on an objective in order to score it. For some armies, this is easier than others. If you have some of the tools we'll talk about below, it's relatively easy to reach out and hurt enemy units. But this is going to require some aggression. You are going to have to push here. You can't passively score this even early in the game. And indeed, if you draw it round 1, it's often very hard to find enemy units on objectives because players place quite carefully to avoid giving you this too easily at the start of the game. I think one of the other trade-offs with Overwhelming Force is that you can, in pursuit of kills to get your points, you need to kill 2 units, need to maybe prioritize some weaker enemy targets, small squads of 5, wounded unit, wounded vehicle, those kinds of things in order to score it. And you do need to do a quick threat assessment in your turn and make sure that you don't absolutely have to be dealing with like a big hard target. That might mean scoring this is a little bit less guaranteed, although it's worth saying getting 3 for killing 1 unit is still very, very good. In terms of tools that you want, here again, for overwhelming force, push units are great, stuff that can run out and attack enemies on an objective. Chaos Chosen are a really good example of this. Anything with really good shooting that's able to get a bead on an enemy objective and kill the opponent, really useful. Fire Prisms, for example. But one that helps you to score this consistently, even when the opponent is playing very defensively, is artillery, and I include the Whirlwind there. That's the big advantage of things like Whirlwinds, Night Spinners, Manticores, is your opponent's going to want to stand on objectives, which means having stuff that's going to be able to hit them on their objectives, even the ones that aren't in full sight or within your reach, is definitely useful because that helps to access things like overwhelming force should you draw the card. When to twist this? So if you draw this round 1, it can be tempting to throw it away, whether for a CP or not. And you will know with your own army whether you really want to build up CP early in the game or not. There is a case to be made for getting rid of it, but I think the thing with overwhelming force is that even if you do draw it round 1, the chances of there being objectives to fight over and enemy units to kill on them next round is very high. And because, as we've stated, you can start scoring this in your opponent's turn and just get some points for killing enemy units in your opponent's turn, it's still valuable even if you don't manage to draw it, because if they try to come and fight you, and you have ways of hurting them back via maybe Overwatch or Fight First, etc., it's still plausible that you can score this even if you didn't score it in your own turn. I think where it's most difficult is if you're looking across the table and you're just seeing enemy units that you don't back yourself to be able to reach or to kill. And that's the real challenge, right? Let's say a huge wall of Death Guard vehicles is coming across at you. You don't think you're going to be able to get enough force to bear on one of them to destroy it. So resilient armies that present challenges, and are you going to require multiple turns just to chop through one unit? Again, Deathwing Knights is a good example, or a big Chaos Terminator slap. It might be that Overwhelming Force isn't going to be a card you can prioritize because you have other things that you need to do. In general, though, I think this is one people score pretty happily, and it's just working out whether you want to just hold on to it for another turn just for all the juicy bits of your opponent's army to start coming out and giving you opportunities. Stormhostile Objective up next. So this is a great one. At the end of your turn, if either of the below conditions are satisfied, this secondary mission is achieved, and you score 4 VP if you're using fixed missions, or 5 VP if you're using tactical missions. If you control one or more objective markers that were controlled by your opponent at the start of the turn, or your opponent didn't control any objectives at the start of the turn, and you control one or more objective markers that you did not control at the start of the turn. Pretty straightforward to score. You can't score it in the first battle round, however, it gets reshuffled if you do, and that does limit Stormhostile Objective in certain ways. So in terms of the trade-offs, in order to take an objective off the opponent, you're going to have to commit some assets to do it. Some of these can be much cheaper and easier to throw away than others, but you do need to weigh up whether you're able to leverage an opponent off a point, whether that's via OC or via shooting or via melee. If the opponent has secured their objectives with extremely powerful, tough, strong forces, and they've got a Norn emissary on a point, it's OC 15, you don't think you're going to be able to kill it, then it's not necessarily going to work. But I think a lot of the time, this is what you should be doing in 40k. We're all building lists to try and knock our opponent off objectives, keep their primary down. So in the main, I think it's something that you should be looking to score. You want your push units, again, there's a running theme here, stuff that can go out, force the issue, knock the opponent off of objectives. Hearthguard for my Votan do this very nicely, drop them down, walk up, push onto the point, take it off the opponent. But you can equally achieve flipping an objective with good disposable OC, so I include Cabalites there in the top right, just booping some cheap troops onto a point, like as we used to do in Ninth all the time, to just flip it for the turn, keep the score down. You're not necessarily going to establish a strong foothold on that point, but you can take it for long enough to stop the opponent from holding it. When do you twist on this? Well, I think you need to assess the game state very carefully. This is only going to work if you're obviously in a position to make a push for an opponent's objective and you think you've got a way in to do that. If you don't, it isn't particularly valuable. I think it's one that you may well throw away if you are in a position where you're unable to push. But obviously, this is something you absolutely want to have resources to be able to do, and things will often be going wrong, or you're having to play a particular game you might not be able to get out. For example, if you've been pinned in, you can't actually get to the opponent's objectives, then maybe that's not a time to try and do this. Would you take it as a fixed objective? Because you can't score it turn one, I think the sort of ceiling on Stormhostile Objective is quite low, right? Caps at 16. And because it involves taking points off your opponent, it does give your opponent agency to not give you easy objectives to flip, to not play that trading game, and to stand back. This was something that always used to happen with shock tactics at Space Marine Secondary back in the day. So it's risky. I would say it's a risky take, and I'm not sure it's one that you'd necessarily want to be trying to build around at the moment when there are better options. Finally, we have engage on all fronts. So at the end of your turn, if you have one or more qualifying units, see below, from your army wholly within 3 or more different table quarters, and those units are all more than 3 inches away from any other table quarter, this secondary mission is achieved and you score 4 VP if you have qualifying units in 4 different table quarters, or 2 if you have qualifying units in 3 different table quarters. Whilst a unit is battle shocked, it is not a qualifying unit, so that's one to keep an eye out for. If, when you draw this card, you only have 2 units remaining, you can discard this secondary mission card and draw a new secondary mission card. And obviously you get extra points for this, an extra point if you do this in tactical. Now, engage has always been a tempting one. These movement-based ones where it doesn't feel like you need to fight the enemy or to engage the enemy, certain armies can play them really well, and certain game plans do build very much around them because you don't need to interact quite as much. In terms of trade-offs, though, I think secondaries that involve positioning like engage are much more likely to create asset loss situations. If you have to go and stick out in several unnatural places on the board, particularly putting assets in all 4 corners, at least 2 of which will usually be, your opponent's prime territory, then you are at risk of losing units. And this is why, as we'll come to in a moment, I think secondaries like this suit armies that are happy to throw units away. So what tools do you want for this? Quick disposable units. And there's the Drukhari again, because Drukhari always enjoy secondaries like this. I think being able to throw things away into quarters and not worry about the damage it's going to do to your overall plan makes scoring things like engage much easier. Speed is obviously of the essence to get to the places you need to go. Do you twist on this? I think even for slower armies, you can usually score the small version of this early. If it comes up early enough in the game and you haven't been completely destroyed, it's usually quite all right for you to assess the situation and go, well, I don't want to throw things into all 4 quarters, but I can certainly spread out into 3, make a push on one side. And that should line up with the overall struggle for board control that you're engaging in anyway. What you need to decide is, do I have enough resources to throw something away to score the full version? How important this turn is getting 5 on this versus getting 3. I think something we're all still figuring out is that because with tactical cards, you're only trying to score 40 and you have 5 turns to do it, it's okay not to have those big 10, 13 point turns, because as long as you have those once or twice, you're in a much better position then to make sure you max your secondaries. So I think sometimes it's about assessing the sort of relative merits here. Is my secondary score currently high enough? Is this a good time for me to build up an early lead? Or can I afford, with the state of the game at the moment, to take my time, settle for a 3 rather than a 5, and keep more resources intact to continue fighting the battle? Now, would you take this as fixed? I think for a lot of armies, behind enemy lines scores more consistently for less risk. Just booping one cheap unit into the enemy deployment zone to score is easier than spreading out across multiple directions. That said, I think full board pressure armies like Orcs and Nids can score engage really reliable all game. They just have so many units to just spread out, fill the board, score their points, and it kind of overlaps with how they want to play the game. So that's something for you to identify. If you have a very asset and body rich army that's quick and wants to contest the entire board, engage is absolutely plausible. It is also easier on some deployments rather than others, particularly diagonal ways deployments. It's easier to naturally spread out into a couple of quarters outside of your deployment zone. The ones where you're going directly at the opponent are much harder. So I think it's one to think about versus the kind of deployment that you have as well, and think about how realistic is it for me to get stuff into these corners all game long. Thank you very much for watching. Obviously, this is part 1. I'm going to work my way through the entire deck of secondary cards, so I'll be drawing the next set in a week or 2. Thanks so much to everybody for watching our 6++ content. Obviously, we have a whole bunch of new shows coming out on YouTube all of the time. Please do hit like and subscribe. Come catch one of our live shows and support us on the Patreon if you really like what we're doing. Have a great time out there, play some 40k, and may all your secondary scores be high.